It is such an honor to be in this position. I've just finished month 10 as state director, and it has been illuminating and invigorating and challenging. And as a parent of a child with a disability, I know firsthand my own journey with my daughter, which is different from everyone else's journey with their children. However, we have some commonalities, and in that we are in a system that is evolving. And for many who've been in the industry for a long time, they see the pendulum swing back and forth. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is not new. And so a little bit of background, just so you know where I'm grounded. My daughter Shelby is 19 now, and we've been on an incredible journey. And I have personally of being enlightened about education. And it was because of her and my great frustration coming out of a beautiful early intervention situation that I began to ask a lot of questions about what our system expected for our students with disabilities, especially our students with more challenging cognitive and physical disabilities, often labeled mod severe, and I didn't understand why we would have such different expectations for this group of students than everyone else. And so that led me to getting a teaching credential and to really delving deep into policy to try to understand firsthand what any one parent could potentially do. And I know I see many faces out here of parents who've felt similarly, because I've talked to you. What can we individually, and then what can we collectively do to change the system? So somehow, my journey led me here as state director of special ed, and I can certainly tell you that I never imagined this would be the plan, but it's such a great honor, especially right now, because we are at a really unique time. And the Special Education Task Force, as Maureen will talk more about, really helped to be a catalyst for some change. And again, even though a lot of the things that we've been talking about are not new, there is renewed momentum and focus on this population of students who, according to our accountability system, are the most challenged, and we know that they are. So we have a lot ahead in terms of what the possibilities are, and I would tell you today that we're only limited by what we can imagine or not imagine for this population. So we're going to give you some background, we're going to give you some context. You'll hear my excitement, and I hope my challenge to you to go back out into your communities, both your research communities, your family communities, and your district communities, to be a strong voice, because the state can provide, just like the federal IDEA provides for us, a backbone to bump up against. But what really happens for our students happens in every single community and district that serves our kids. So this is definitely a collaboration and a joint effort. Maureen?
Thank you. This is definitely a collaboration and a joint effort, and I'd like to reinforce your comment, Kristin, about this being such an honor to be able to be up here and to be here with Kristin, who I first met when I became a commissioner, and she was the chair of the advisory commission. I had been a SELPA director for a long time now. I earned all my gray hair here, so it has been a long time, and it was gray then even. So, but that really rooted a lot of the wishes and desires that my profession had brought me to as a special education administrator, because I have a lot of beliefs, and so I'd become really active in the world of policy, and by being able to be a commissioner, that seemed like such a wonderful honor. And then I had Mike Kirst, who's our current state board president, send me an email asking if I'd be interested in helping lead a task force effort for the state of California on policy change. And that question was just like, are you kidding? This is the best opportunity to make a difference. And so we felt that it would be important to just give you a little background, because I don't know how familiar people are with the task force work. And I do want to give honor to Mike Kirst and Linda Darling-Hammond and the whole Department of Education, who agreed together to say, let's bring some people together and try to figure out what are the barriers to improved outcomes for children with disabilities in California. And then based on those barriers and the information that you get during a process, what do you recommend for change? And it really was an incredible journey to be able to work with very caring people with lots of input from people all over the state to try to identify what those barriers were and then what we could do about it. And we're not going to be able to do everything, but we did come up with about, I think it's 100 pages of multiple recommendations. And that's now been 2 years ago. So a year ago, which I believe was the day we announced that you had just been selected to be the Director of Special Ed for California, we did give an update. And the great news is that change is continuing from our recommendations. So for those who didn't participate in the task force or don't have a good grounding in it, let me just give you a quick summary of it. We decided that we would break into 5 different subcommittees. Well, let me back up even a little bit further. Mike and Linda said, could you choose about 20 people in California who would represent the range of California to come up with this work? And we said, you're not going to get the variety in 20 people, but how do you choose to get that kind of variety? So we ended up with 34 people plus resource people from the Department of Ed, from the board, from the commission, and from the legislature to support a conversation. But you can't have a conversation with now 55 people. So we broke up into subcommittees, and each of those subcommittees then continued to come back and forth with each other for the different conversations and to come up with recommendations in all of these different subcommittee areas. So we had a section for early learning, which was really our birth to 5 group, and they have a whole set of recommendations. We collectively did. We had a section on what originally started to be teacher preparation, and we ended up changing that to educator preparation because there's so many people who are involved in the supports for children with disabilities in California beyond just the teacher. And then we changed that to educator preparation and professional development because we realized that we have an already trained group of people in the professions in education in California who went through the system that they got to help get us to this point where we recognized all these barriers were. And so we wanted to talk about professional learning and professional development for the already existing staff as well. One of our biggest and most challenged groups was best practices, evidence-based practices. And they looked at everything from the best ways to instruct children to mental health, to civil rights, to more on professional development and how those things would work together. And we had a big section on finance because one of the biggest barriers that probably everyone mentioned is that special education in California is inadequately funded. And it's inadequately funded in programming, in transportation, in low incidence services, in every element, if you separate it out completely as if only special ed dollars were there to support all of the special ed services, which none of us believed was the way to go, but it still was one of the issues. So each of these subcommittees did come up with various recommendations. We did give this group an update on that last year, and today we have even more progress to report. So I think we're ready.
I'd love to give you a little background on who we're talking about in California, just how many students and what does this all mean, and what is our job as a state to ensure under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and what does that mean locally? So the title, Getting Kids What They Need, Where They Need, When They Need It, is really sort of how I look at our job in general as a state to provide that backbone. And when we're talking about students, just to give you like just a visual, if you were to take 6 of the largest ballparks, coliseums, if you will, in California and fill them up, that still wouldn't be the number of students with disabilities in California. That's a lot of kids. For me, that was sort of like That's a lot of kids. So we have more than 750,000 students with disabilities aged 0 to 22. And those are our students that have individualized education programs or IFSPs in early education. And that does not include students who have a myriad of special needs who do not actually qualify for special education. Many are on Section 504 plans, as you know. And so this is just our students with disabilities, and this is the purview of the Department of Education Special Education Division. So my hardworking 150 diligent staff members, mostly former educators and administrators in districts, are diligently trying to check and balance to ensure that our students are getting what they need. Nearly half of them are between 6 and 12 years old. And so a lot of times we hear that, this number was surprising to me because you hear that most of them are in early intervention, or they start off younger and then filter off. These are the kids that are getting identified, many of them later. So you'll see the graph in a little while to see the difference between the different age groups. 68% of boys, 68% are boys, 29% are English learners. And for our top 3 primary disability categories, autism is now in the top 3, which I'm sure also will be of no surprise to you. So when we're looking at age groups, here's sort of the breakdown. I'm bringing you this information just so that you can get a picture. There are, and I'll leave it up to some of the researchers to look at some of the whys. There's a multitude of reasons why we're looking at different ages, different disability categories. Some of it has to do with culture, and some of it in terms of just disability culture and the culture of how we educate students. Some of it has to do with just when kids get identified. So in terms of a breakdown by race and ethnicity, here is our breakdown. What I will point out is one of the things that we're very focused on, because it's a focus also under the IDEA of one of our big responsibilities, which is to make sure that we don't have what's called disproportionate numbers of students in certain groups and certain ethnicities and disability categories in our population. So what you look at essentially is if we have 11%, if we have 11% of the population in one or more in a category, that's how many kids are across the state, students with disabilities, 11% of our total population. We look to see if that's consistent in other subgroups, and I'll show you a few more graphs in a minute. Here's our breakdown by disability category. This is always a question I get, so I've included this, and again, we could talk all day about why and how and what this means, but I'll let you take that back and chew on that for a while.
Could I say one thing about that one?
Yeah.
When I started in special education in California as a school psychologist in 1983, the autism percentage was about 1%. So in not all that many years, the fact that it is now up there at 13.86% of the entire set of kids with disabilities with IEPs in California, when you hear about the tsunami and the huge effect of kids with autism, that number is the one that really shows that.
Yep. And also, many of our students have multiple disabilities, as we know. So when you're looking at these data, this is the primary disability category that's identified for them under IDEA to qualify for an IEP. Okay. This one's a little bit harder to read, but I thought this was interesting because it shows what types of supports and services we're providing our students with disabilities. And the top one you'll see is specialized academic instruction, also sometimes known as specially designed instruction. And that's usually what's called out in the IEP as specific instruction that student's working with a special educator or someone who's specially trained to work with students with disabilities. And you'll see the list goes on. And each of these, there is no prescription, as you know, for IEPs. So each of these is up to the individual IEP team with the families and the districts and the specialists to determine what works the best for students with disabilities and that individual student. One thing I will say is that there is, as many of you know, a greater renewed focus and push on serving students much more inclusively. And so for many years, the trend has been more toward a lot of special day class instruction for our students with disabilities. That is still considered part of the full continuum. So when you hear everyone's going to full inclusion, I've had a couple parents say, we hear that our state is going to full inclusion. What I'll say about that is that my personal belief and the evidence base supports that the majority of students do better when they are in classrooms with their general ed typical developing peers, getting access to the state standards at their grade level. Does that mean everyone all the time for every minute should be included? No. But it means that we start with the most inclusive environment possible for our students, and we put the supports in place to help them be in that environment, and then we go from there. So again, it's individualized, there's a range, but California is in the bottom 10% of states around access to general education for our students with disabilities. So we're not trending in our practices in that regard. It is an area that as a state we're working on, and in terms of how general education, and we'll get into it a little bit more when we talk about the task force recommendations, the idea that we create general education environments that are much more accessible to the full continuum of learner allows us the opportunity to include many more students. So it makes it less about our students with disabilities having to fit into something that may not actually be the most effective environment for any student, to bringing to the table the opportunity for very, very enriched environments that are universally designed.
When I first looked at the slide that showed these percentages, it confused me. So just in case it confuses other people, the percentages are because the total number of services is what the percentage is of. So if you look at 600,000 of the students get specialized academic instruction, that's like 6/7 of the students with IEPs. But of the total number of services, it's 34%. So that was just something that we talked about ahead of time to make sure we get clear here.
Yeah. Thank you. Here is sort of what I was talking about a minute ago in terms of educational placement. So those are by number of students, and public day schools, so this is the place that they're served. It doesn't mean necessarily the amount of time they're spending in general ed versus special ed. It means they're on a general education, like the top one, they're on a general education school site, okay? So the majority of our kids are there. We're looking for more opportunities for them to be fully participating with their peers to the greatest extent possible for them to make progress. A couple other things to point out is in the past few years, the percentage of students with disabilities served by charter schools has increased. The gap for that is closing. For many years, there were a lot less students being served in charter schools. Currently, there are many more students being served in charter schools and more of the full continuum of students being served in charter schools. So this is a graph I want you to pay very close attention to, because this is going to help you in your local LEAs and communities have this conversation with your schools and school districts. This is the local control funding formula subgroups. And for those of you who are familiar with how we fund students in California, we fund everyone, including students with disabilities, at a base rate per student. So every day they go to school, every student earns dollars towards their school and their education. If you have a higher concentration of certain subgroups of students, which include students who are socio-economically disadvantaged, students who are English learners, and students who are foster youth, your district may get more money, okay? All of those subgroups and all students earn the base, including students with disabilities. Then there is an additional weight if you have what's considered a more challenged population, And then on top of that, you get dollars for special education, also based on average daily, or per pupil average daily attendance, okay? And so if you look at the far left Pac-Man, we'll call them, that's all students in California. 11% of them are students with disabilities, okay? If you just pulled out the students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, 12% of that population are students with disabilities. If you look at English learners, 16% are students with disabilities, and foster youth, you see even higher. What we'd expect to see in a non-disproportionate scenario is that all those would have 11% students with disabilities, okay? If they don't, they're considered disproportionate. They have a higher incidence of students with disabilities in that subpopulation. The other thing to point out, and so this particular graph is important because what it also represents is each of these subgroups, not only are they kids, general education students, because everyone is, they're also students who may be challenged in one of these other areas, but they're also students with disabilities. We're not taking our students with disabilities out of all the pies, or out of the Pac-Man, and putting them somewhere else. They're the same kid, and you could have a student who's everything, right? So we've had a lot of questions about where does special ed fit in our LCAP? Where does special ed, how do we make sure that our districts are talking about special ed? Because they say that our dollars aren't in the LCAP. Our dollars aren't in LCFF. But guess what? Every student is earning money towards the education of students in that district, including students with disabilities. So the money that comes in for special ed comes in addition to that to support and mitigate the issues that come with having a disability, okay? So we are part of that conversation. What is currently being discussed at great length and has been being discussed for many years is where do the special ed dollars fit in and how do you talk about them? And so it's true they were not included as one of the weighted categories in the local control funding formula, but those dollars need to work in concert with the dollars and the programming that comes out of your local control accountability plans in your school districts. So it's really important that special ed is at the table because all that should be aligned and working together because you get more when you're working together. You're not taking out all the kids with disabilities and putting them over here and saying, well, here's your programming, here's your education, here's everything. You're saying, we're all everything, and all of our students are general education students first, okay? One of the most compelling discussions we've had at the state board level was that of our students with disabilities, if you take that students with disability subgroup of 11% of kids, 70% of them are in one or more of those LCFF subgroups. So we're talking about a huge overlap of kids, okay? You don't have to wear a single label. We'll give you lots of labels. As I was perusing Ed Code late one night, I discovered as we're haggling at the Department of Education over the wording of how we want to talk about supporting students in California. Do we want to call them all students? We support all students. Do we want to talk about each student? And I looked at Ed Code and I said, oh, look, it's already in state law. Each child is a unique person with unique needs, and the purpose of the education system of this state is to enable each child to develop all or his or her own potential. So I sent a little email to the leadership team at the department and the chief deputy and said, hey, you know those hours we've been spending trying to wordsmith some grand statement? It's already in state law. And so I got an email back saying, I love it when that happens. We'll just use that. So just so you know, when you want to take back something that's in state law and talking about our kids with disabilities that have unique needs, there it is. So we talked a little bit before about our federal backdrop of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if we do anything at the Department of Education that we have to do legally and that our LEAs count on us to do, LEAs being local educational agencies, those include charter schools, school districts, and county offices of education. We provide our districts the same backdrop that the IDEA provides us. And so whenever someone says, well, we can't do that, and we say, well, the IDEA says we need to do that. And so for California, in order for us to get 1/5 approximately of the money we need for special ed, This is how much special ed is costing in California right now. We get a little over $1 billion, I think $1.2 billion a year from the federal government for special education. But our promise when we take that $1 billion is that we will abide by all the tenets and requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so when you look in there, if you ever want to peruse something late at night because you can't sleep, that will also lay out what we've also adopted into state statute, which is those rights and responsibilities. And so here at the Department of Education, our job is to make sure that we support our local educational agencies in upholding those things. And so the top one is to make sure that they have a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. We monitor districts in cycles all year, every year, and have all kinds of activities we do to check and balance whether or not they're meeting least restrictive environment targets, assessment targets, all those kinds of things. So on top of the regular accountability system for our state, we have like a micro accountability system at the Department of Education in the special ed division that we're responsible to report to the feds on, okay? The second piece, and the one that I love and think is most critical, is really our responsibilities to ensure that parents understand their rights and that we let them know about procedural safeguards, and we're there to assist. So we do have an 800 line at the department that you can call if you have questions about your procedural safeguards or something that's happening around what rights and responsibilities your district has or your school has, and we're happy to help you with that. So a big part of our staff answer calls every day to answer questions, to take in complaints. Many of you have probably heard in some of the talks about the federal government wanting to cut education dollars in the federal education budget and the federal civil rights budget. We will still have the responsibility in California and everywhere to uphold the IDEA regardless of what's cut, okay? One of the concerns by some of the disability advocates, however, is that when you cut the Office of Civil Rights, you basically limit the ability for the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's really important because that is sort of our partner in crime, right? It ensures a lot of other things along with IDEA for all of our citizens with disabilities. So that's concerning to us, and as a department, we've expressed that to our representatives. So, big picture outcomes. What are we mapping to for our students? And for me, being around this work for a long time, this is new. We have not been mapping to work from where I was sitting. And in fact, for my own daughter, no one ever even mentioned it, right? But today, there is a real expectation that every single person who wants to work in this state has the opportunity and support to do so. But our responsibility in education and as parents is to believe that our children have the potential and ability to do that, even with a lot of support if that's necessary. So this is sort of exciting and scary at the same time, especially as a parent. I haven't been preparing myself to have my daughter work, and I don't know if you've been preparing to have your kids work. I just wanted her to be really happy and have a really good life and get all of her needs met and not cry. So how do we kind of switch our gears on that? I like to think of this as the best backbone ever to get her needs met in the education system. What are the things that you need to prepare to be a citizen and to work? Because if you're thinking about work, you're thinking of where you go each day, your community of people that know you and support you and believe in you besides your family. And what do you need to do in order to be there and be productive and get your needs met? Well, you need to be able to communicate. So that whole idea of communicative competence for all of our students becomes even more forefront. I love that idea. I don't know if you do too. But some of those simple things, when you're not mapping to something really concrete, fall by the wayside. As you know, what we're going to try to help her communicate, as opposed to we expect every student to be able to have a mode and method of communication so that we can know what they know, so we're not limiting them. They may know a lot, and just because they're nonverbal or they can't hear or whatever their disability is should not limit them from the possibility of work. And so what we do have now, and I think I talked a little bit about the why, which is, first it establishes our belief that everyone has potential, right? So that's a core operating principle that we have to ingrain in everyone, starting with our early childhood teams and our families. It does provide us those tangible skills like you have to be able to communicate, you have to be able to be with people and behave yourself with people. We all do. It's not an additional expectation of people with disabilities, it's just an expectation of living in a community. And that we encourage those partnerships and vision with all of the agencies that we work with, so we're all mapping to the same thing. And so the cool thing is that we're not just saying this alone. We actually have 4 state agencies and 4 heads of state agencies all agreeing that that's what we're doing. And so before, it was like we were trying to do something by ourselves with workability and transition. Now, we have the Employment Development Department and the Department of Rehab and the Department of Developmental Services all saying, yep, we're all in this together, and so we're gonna stand together and figure out how to map our system together so it's so much more user-friendly for all of us, all the parents and the families who need to use it, instead of having to transition between all these agencies with different backpacks of different colors and learning different language. So we're working really hard at the department to look at those templates and other tangible things that map to employment to make those common, to make those so much more usable for parents. So look for in the next year or so for some invitations to come provide some input on that. And just to mention too, with competitive integrated employment, and you're reading kind of the Department of Developmental Services and all the agencies that I mentioned, there is actually a blueprint, and I have those resources for you at the end of this presentation. So I hope this resonates with you about this job staff, because we really need to have support from our state and for parents to really believe that this is possible. Because we want to change. I had someone tell me, and I think it was Joe Xavier from the Department of Rehabilitation, who's a phenomenal leader at the Department of Rehabilitation and is really family focused. And he said, I've been talking to business leaders and we have a problem. And the problem is that the business leaders of today were never educated with the people of disabilities of their day. They were all educated separately. And so if we don't educate our students of today, we're not going to have business leaders who believe in what's possible for our students in 10 or 20 years. Because those are all the people who are going to be owning the businesses and who are going to be hiring our students with disabilities. So I thought that was really profound because I hadn't really thought of that aspect of why inclusion matters, but it's another reason that inclusion matters. So promoting that culture that everyone belongs from the beginning, from preschool, from the second they enter the world, but then leave early intervention into the school system, that's the critical juncture right there. That's the time everyone is taught who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so the second piece I mentioned earlier, that communicative competence piece, part of people believing people are capable is knowing that they know things. And so once my own daughter got communication and started being able to describe what she knew, she suddenly had a lot more access to a lot more education than she did the year before. And supporting our teachers and related service providers in really getting the basics of universal design for learning, and for you as parents and practitioners to ask the question, how are we preparing and giving summer professional learning to our teachers to make sure our kids can be included so that the special educator's not dying off trying to redo every single lesson plan for every single subject every day? That would make a huge difference. and developing person-centered plans that run across all of the segments, right? So we can do our part at the Department of Education to try to make those more seamless, but we also need your partnership and your vision as parents and practitioners to say, is this plan really person-centered, and is it mapped to that vision of employment one day? And if it's not, why isn't it? So I really like this Folan. I'm a Folan fan. I don't know if many of you are as well. Hope, optimism, and self-belief among teachers are the vital wellsprings of successful learning and positive educational change. It's individuals who must hope, but it is institutions that create the climate and conditions which people feel more hopeful or less so. So I feel a huge responsibility with this. I hope you all do too, because I think there is a lot of possibility for change, and the task force has really provided us a nice catalyst, and I personally bring it to the table as evidence, so it's not just a parent or an advocate talking, it's a group of individuals and experts who say, things need to be different.
That is exactly what the task force recommended, is that we really needed one system of education that would involve all students and involve all the staff to appropriately support all of them. This really did expect then a culture change at multiple different levels, and so this was a good description of what it was that we're looking for and what we have been recommended at the time and have been continuing to work towards since then. One of the other points that Kristin just clarified, though, is this whole idea of IDEA funding, and that special ed funding hasn't been included in the LCAP in California. When we were asked to identify barriers and outcomes, one of the barriers was our separate funding system, because we have said, here's education, and here's special education. And I can remember even being in IEP meetings where a disability was identified for a child, and so the team would say, oh, well, we have a class for that kind of child. Put them over there and fund them over there, and don't fund them over here anymore. And that never made any sense, right? And so to improve outcomes meant to say, well, how can we make sure that kids are included so that they do have the opportunities to be in general education classrooms, so that they can work and get a job and be productive members of society to the best of their abilities. And so that's really what our task force worked for. So what we wanted to do was talk a little bit about, okay, where are those changes now? So our biggest recommendation was this need for the one unified coherent system of education, and the need for all educators to be prepared to work effectively with all children. That was the most common complaint from we held 6 public hearings around the state with hundreds of people coming to talk about what they thought were the barriers to success for kids with outcomes. And one of the biggest, including from general education teachers, was that general education teachers really didn't know what to do with kids with disabilities. Thank you anyway. And so the opportunity to say, let somebody else take care of them, was a good solution for everybody. And we as special educators were kind of like the Statue of Liberty, saying, give us all of your children with disabilities, we'll take care of them. And the fact of the matter is that didn't work. And so what we had to say was, well, what will work? And so the idea that we would have all educators be prepared to work to serve all children so that kids with disabilities could be in general education classrooms became one of the primary driving forces of all of the recommendations and the support for the whole concept of LRE. So that commitment to serve all students and recognize that they really are all general education students first. Funding does come for every single child in California as a first. Special ed dollars are only a supplement to that, but they have to be considered general education students first.
So we have evidence that the system is evolving, and this is our evidence at the state level. And so as we set more of the criteria on the state level, like Folan had said, we hope to help the system shift. And despite the fact that we currently have local control, which means that all districts really get to decide how they're going to deliver education, they all still are bound by all of the requirements of the IDEA and in serving our students with disabilities. So one of the big signals that we've had just in the last few weeks is a move of our division. And so previously, over the years, we've been part of a branch that included nutrition services and expanded learning and sort of the things that didn't really fit with anything else. We weren't accountability. We were technically not teaching and learning, according to some old thinking. And we have just been relocated into the branch called Teaching and Learning Support. And the cool thing about that is that puts us with all of our partners who are doing teaching and learning, which is really what we're about. Our job is to ensure that students with disabilities get the education that they're entitled to. And so I feel like a kid in a candy store in my new division meetings, which we've had a couple, where you all know that sitting around a table with people who are collaborating, becoming part of that collaboration is half the battle. And it's like we talk about in inclusion. First, you got to get there and be in the room. Now we're in the room. And what I can tell you is they've been eager to collaborate. It just hasn't been that easy because when you're not with people in meetings and you don't have regular outcomes that are designed together, you're not with them. We have seen many more universities start to blend teacher, general, and special education programs. There's been a big project called the CEDAR project that has 7 universities been involved in that have basically taken their teacher prep programs and blended them, which is really exciting because that puts our special educators and general educators together. And our Commission on Teacher Credentialing has adopted new teacher performance expectations. So as part of all this change in universities, the way they prepare our teachers, there are also new expectations that our general education teachers are getting a lot more basics that our special education teachers used to only get. Yes.
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 Amens are okay.
So this fall, I invite you to tune in and weigh in at the Commission on Teacher Credentialing over the next few meetings because they'll be discussing what it means to be a special educator in the new light of there being more provided to general education teachers, what makes special education special, and what do we need to have in terms of credentialing, understanding there's a huge shortage of special educators. So we have a lot of intern teachers and student teachers in practice right now. And also understanding that, that we want to make sure that we still have specialty. We have 13% of our population that is diagnosed with autism, according to their IEP, right? We need to have people that have that kind of expertise to make sure that we get our kids what they need to be the true specialists that we are. So I really invite you to weigh into that because this is being decided basically as we speak, and we do need more voices from families and from special educators and practitioners to weigh into that process.
So one example of that is the need for both general education teachers and special education teachers to know more about collaboration. How do you co-teach? How do you team teach? How do you allow the general education curriculum to be understood by all and the special ed teacher to support? So, for example, with accommodations, modifications, the extra that would be the specially designed instruction, but that doesn't have to be outside of that general education classroom.
And one of the benefits to being now part of the Teaching and Learning Support branch is that we're with all the curriculum and frameworks and instruction people. And we know, because we've all been in the schools, that a lot of times our curriculum is not designed for the edges, so to speak. Our curriculum does not have everything we need in order to serve our student with more moderate to severe disabilities. And so some recent conversations are very promising around how do we ensure that all curriculum and instruction that's adopted, at least by the state, includes the full range of learners so that we're not going out and trying to find something or our special ed teachers are Googling images at night to try to help it make sense for our kids with disabilities, because that's not a good use of their time and expertise. We want them working with our kids, not having to print extra things off. We need to really help our schools provide the full array of supports for our teachers so they can teach all our kids. So more evidence. So the task force recommended that we ensure universal design for learning is understood. Does everyone know what universal design for learning is? So there are principles that basically set out how you would design instructions for the variety of learners, depending on how you learn, what mode and methodologies you might need to learn, so that you wouldn't have to augment or differentiate as much in instruction. It's intentional planning for every kind of learner, for every lesson. So an example would be, we're going to do an ELA lesson, an English lesson, and you may be reading a chapter from a book, and you may be watching a TED Talk on it, and you may be working with a partner with some annotated notes, and you may be looking at a video or pictorial representation, and you're all learning the same thing, and then you'll be able to demonstrate what you know in the method and modality that you do. So you may not be a person who's able to type, or you may be able to express yourself in some other way. That's perfectly fine. So it's being able to express yourself in a multitude of ways and receive the information in a multitude of ways. So whatever your disability is, say you're dyslexic and you can't read as fast as everyone else, or you can't get the content in the same way, you're still getting the same level of content, right? So that you're not completely out of the conversation. You are also learning. And so we make sure to augment and support all of our learners in the classroom, which has shown to significantly reduce behaviors, because there's not only one ticket into learning.
Right. Universal design came originally as an architectural concept. So if you think about access for everyone, that's what universal design for learning is that if here's your standards that you expect everyone to know, how do you ensure that that access is there for every student?
It's intentional, very intentional. And like Maureen's talking about, if you're creating a walkway that's accessible to someone in a wheelchair, you've now just allowed a new mom with a new baby to have access in their stroller. The task force also recommended multi-tiered system of support be scaled statewide. Multi-system of support frameworks are really basically that intentional planning. It's 3 tiers, and intentional planning for all students to get the supports they need, where they need it, when they need it, right? So an example would be this universal design for learning. In Tier 1 instruction, general ed instruction, we do the best job we can in Tier 1, so we have less kids that we have to provide additional supports to, okay? And just for clarification, if you're a student with a disability, you still have access to a multi-tiered system of support in your environment. It's not a tier, it's not response to intervention. It's an intentional planning of a state. So California's looking at a multi-tiered system of support and how we provide resources and supports to our districts. Districts do it for their schools, schools do it for their classrooms, and classrooms do it for their students, okay? So it's just an intentional way of planning for everyone to have access, and that we have intentional supports in place for the next level of support. So $40 million was allocated a few years ago through the budget to scale this idea of everyone using this multi-tiered system of support to help include all students in education. And this work just went on this whole last week with 1,200 participants in Orange County, and all of our county offices are being trained in this. So in your area, you can be guaranteed that someone has gone to a training on multi-tiered system of support. And this is a way that you can really look at how to do your local control accountability planning, is using this lens.
And just so those of you who aren't necessarily school people, the whole multi-tiered system of support rollout is the idea that you train to train to train. So even if you're not part of a county office, your school district is part of a county, and that county office can then help you. So the idea really is to have started the ripple in the pond so that eventually everybody gets that training on how can I participate in a system that offers appropriate supports when a child needs it along the way.
So one of the things you can ask your districts and your schools is how are they intentionally planning for every student? And how are they planning for every student to be included to the greatest extent possible? And that has to do with their teacher training, with how they're supporting students there, how they're thinking about using instructional aid and paraeducator support, all those things. And ensuring, so another recommendation was ensuring general ed resources were used as early as possible. This goes back to what we're talking about. This is not, special ed, issues with special education, as many of you know, are not really about special ed or students with disabilities. They're about good planning and general education that are designed to support all students. And then special education can come in as that supplement and accent on that, not as a whole nother separate system of education.
And I want to give another example of that one as well, and that is that another issue that the best practices group looked at in particular was in the area of mental health, because you don't have to be a student with an IEP to be eligible for mental health services in California. We had a whole Mental Health Services Act. We have all kinds of ways that our kids and kids without IEPs need early intervening mental health services. And so this idea that general education resources through your collaboration either with your county mental health, with private providers, with contractors, with the school counselor, with whomever, through your MHSA, your First Five, through whatever group has services that are available to your students, we need to be partnered with in order to get them to students when they need it, rather than waiting for it to be something that gets determined through an IEP process, and that's the only door that gets you to that service. So we wanted to make that be an earlier opportunity.
And some of the best examples that we've seen of intentional planning by our local educational agencies are the ones that have brought multiple partners to the table. So as a district is developing their system of support, they're not just trying to develop it by themselves. They're developing it with all their community partners in mind, because what happens is you're not just talking about students with disabilities. Like we showed on the graph earlier, these students have a multitude of challenges. And like if we're talking about English language learners, even if they're a student with a disability, have an opportunity and a right to get their English language development in addition to their special education supports and services. It's not a one or the other situation, nor is it in any of those cases. I'll just mention that the IEPs that we're all talking about and working on, those need to be aligned to state standards. And this has been a huge conversation, even in my own division over the last few months. Like, you don't mean everyone, right? Yes, we do. And actually, it's not my idea. It's federal law. And so, yes, I understand that sometimes there are kids in 11th grade that may be academically much younger developmentally. But a lot of times, these are our kids who are nonverbal, so we don't actually know. You know, just because someone doesn't talk doesn't mean they're developmentally preschool or an infant. It just means they can't speak or communicate. So at the department and in our division, we continue to talk to districts and schools about, we know it's really challenging sometimes to look at a 11th grade standard and try to match it to a child who has very significant developmental delays. But the reality is that every year, a child is entitled to new information that they learn. And so to prevent someone from getting new information because we don't understand what they know would be very sad. And so, although we work in special education to close gaps in literacy and math and other things, none of that should prevent a child from having access to science and history and the arts, because there are many ways to scaffold that. So when we do monitoring, we actually monitor to see whether or not every single kid's IEP that we look at is aligned to a grade level standard. Doesn't mean they necessarily have to meet that at that day. No, but they need to be working towards that and providing access to all the other content areas. I know for you all, you may be interested in just hearing really quickly about our alternate assessments. So we have statewide assessments that are required for every single student, and this is actually one of the ways that we get our federal funding, is that we ensure that all of our students are assessed in our standardized testing, and that includes our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So we do have alternate assessments for this population. We are developing currently a science test for this population of students. This is typically what you hear is like the 1%. We have limits where we can go over in a state. We cannot test more than a very small 2% of our whole population. So we are continuing to work on that. So if you hear parents say, I don't want my kid assessed, my personal opinion and my director's had opinion is, please allow them to be assessed, because it opens up massive conversations at IEPs around access, communicative competence, accommodations, all the questions that we want to ask in our IEP. So not having that assessment piece in place, a lot of times those conversations don't happen to the same degree.
And helps force the school district to be accountable, which was what one of our main issues from the task force is. We wanted to demonstrate accountability for all kids, that we're making a difference. One of the improved outcomes has to be that they can show us that they've learned.
So you will see all the resources at the end of this presentation, but one of them is our new school dashboard. And that dashboard is an accountability dashboard for all students. And the Students with Disabilities subgroup is blaring red. And that for us is bad news for our students, but good news for us in terms of leveraging change and the potential for change, because a very, very, very bright spotlight is being shined on our students with disabilities population about what can we do as a state to make those changes. And so, as part of our One Coherent System, we're moving our special ed data system, which is very old and very large, into our big data system with everyone else. So all of these little pieces and signals are all adding together for, I think, brighter futures for our students with disabilities in this whole results-driven accountability era. And I know there's some questions. I hope you will go and look at the accountability dashboard and weigh in as we continue to develop it, because once you shine a light on it, then you have to sort of answer the questions, well, then what are you going to do about it, right? And so getting your input and thoughts about that is critical. In terms of monitoring, that's another area now that we're in with our friends in other divisions like EL. We will be looking at how we do better coordinated monitoring. We all do separate monitoring at the state, which makes our districts, not
Crazy.
happy. Yeah.
We really needed to look at overhauling special ed financing because, and we wanted some way to have that be part of an LCAP where there would be this accountability that we're looking at statewide for general ed kids. We need a way to also look at it for special ed so that the funding can better match what it is that we're actually trying to do.
So how can you stay attuned to what's going on? We've just scratched the surface on what's happening in California. I hope we've piqued your interest a little bit because there's so much going on and so much to weigh in on and so much that you can become aware of. The best place to do that is the Advisory Commission on Special Education, because they actually ask and get updates from all the divisions and a lot of the other state activities that are happening across California. And they're actually meeting next week. You are all always invited to attend, but it's also a webcast. And so there's links to that. We also have what has traditionally been the Special Edge. It has just been renamed the Edge. The reason it was renamed was because we don't just want special educators looking at it. We want everyone to understand how to serve our diverse learners. So it's at the Edge, sort of the tagline, teaching to the edges so everyone can learn. And the State Board of Education is also meeting. They are making huge, massive decisions about our education system right now. Massive. So again, lots of opportunity for public input. The disability community has been very quiet. Please come out, read the information. This is your chance to be heard. So you can also get involved locally. Your SELPAs, as you know, have local community advisory committees. And you also have local family empowerment centers and parent training and information centers. Our hosts here, Kelly, is one of them at the Warmline Family Resource Center and Parent Training and Information Center. They are funded to help you. I hope you all have been in contact with your local one. And here's sort of what we've been doing. And coming up next, and in the back we have Richard over there who's going to be presenting on our new Dyslexia Guidelines, who will be coming out in 2 weeks. Those will be published in 2 weeks online. Those guidelines are guidelines. They're not regulations, but they are guidelines that will help the field and families know more of what to do when you have a child with dyslexia. And you can read the rest of our efforts that we've sort of talked about earlier. And here's a few additional resources. If you want to look at the recommendations, there's the website link and the accountability dashboard that you can type in the name of your school and district and see what's going on there. For those of you who are super data wonks and want to just sit all day and run different regressions and wonder what's happening in different parts of the data system, you can look on DataQuest. There's all kinds of different things you can run to find out about the disability populations of places, the makeup of different subgroups, that type of thing, and that's open and public for you to look at. And the blueprint, if you're interested in the employment piece, I recommend you read the blueprint, the California Integrated Employment Blueprint. Again, everyone, it has sort of been a big signal in California that everyone is on board with everyone being able to work to a living wage, and we're working towards that. We're mapping to that in our own division and in the state, and I hope you'll start to talk about that too, so that we can have higher expectations for our students with disabilities. And I want to thank all of you and Maureen and all of our partners and Patty. This is a collaboration, and so whatever I can do to help remove barriers, to help make greater ties and collaborations with all of you, and anything that you're doing out there, please let us know. You know, we're a group of people who care deeply like you do, and we're responsible for being both the hammer and the hand simultaneously, and that's not an always easy balance.
I too want to thank you very much for your interest and your participation, and would really love to reinforce the message about getting involved, because the great news from this task force work is that it is still a living document. When Vicki Barber, my co-executive director, and I presented this to the state board, we said we do not want this to be a report that sits on somebody's shelves and gathers dust or cobwebs. We want it to be a living document that will make policy direction. And it has continued to do that. Our legislature is aware of it. People quote it. In current legislation, there are references to the fact that we need better preschool funding. We need to involve children in inclusive preschools. It is continuing. And so your voice that speaks for our children is really important in all areas. And so I too thank you.
I have a really easy one to start with, and it's where can people find the task force report, the recommendations?
It was right up there. It's actually on the San Mateo County, SMCOE there, that website is the San Mateo County Office of Ed. They were our fiscal agent for that work, and so it continues to be on their website. There's actually the full report, there's an executive summary, and there's subcommittee reports. So if you're particularly interested in, for example, the teacher preparation report, that's summarized in the full report, but there's a lot more data in that one. And I think 3 of our subcommittees had fuller reports too, so there's all kinds of data there.
Okay, and this one just kind of piggybacks on what you were just saying, Maureen. If our state is moving towards unified, coherent system of full inclusion, how do we address the 3 to 5-year-olds who move from early intervention to school system? Do we add generalized public preschool, keep kids in EI until TK or kindergarten or something else?
So I think maybe we both want to answer this one, but if you are not paying attention to legislation, do be sure to get involved with your legislature, because it is our current crop of legislators who are making a difference in bringing forward various possibilities. My assemblyman is Kevin McCarty, and he is a preschool advocate, and he and others in the legislature have brought forward bills that would say, let's get more money into preschool, let's get more money into state preschools, let's have more slots. There's a bunch of different pieces of legislation that have gone forward for preschool, but not everybody hears that that's a great need. So your voice as a representative, both at the state level and nationally, I really recommend you be an advocate for what you believe in, because that's where the big difference is going to change. It has to be a policy and fiscal direction from our state.
Right, and as you know, in federal law, it also states that, you know, a child have an opportunity for the most inclusive environment or least restrictive environment. And so we know, because we don't have universal preschool, that has been challenging, having enough preschool programs. But there are a number of places in the state that have made commitments. So there's a couple LEAs I can think of right now who have basically decided that that's a priority for them. There's nothing preventing a district from deciding in their LCAP that they're going to provide preschool opportunities for more of their students. So that's a local decision and local partnerships. I also recently visited a place that really maximized their funding, and they call it stacking their funding, which is basically looking at all their different preschool programs, because there's preschool programs in state preschool, Head Start, which is federally funded, Title I, and special education. How do you look at those funding? They don't have to be separate places. They just have to work together seamlessly. And that is one of the things that we're looking at as a state, is trying to provide some more of those templates. But there are places in California that are doing that, and that do have inclusive opportunities for all their students with disabilities. And that is critical, because we know as parents, if you start off in a separate setting, segregated, that's sort of where you cut your teeth. And there's a lot around that, just emotionally, whether you start off inclusively or not. So the bottom line is that we expect all of our kids to have inclusive opportunities in preschool. I know for our districts, because I've talked to them, that is very, very challenging. But at the end of the day, that is their actual legal right, is to be in an inclusive setting.
All right, the next question, does the Department of Rehab, CDE, or DDS offer any hands-on staff training or in-service for sister departments with the long-term goal of having an inclusive workforce within state service system?
That is a great question. That is like the best question I've heard all week. That is something that I will bring back to my leadership team and say that I was asked this question this week. We don't have anything that's coordinated, but I think individual departments do have some things, but I will definitely be taking that question back. That's a really good question. I don't have a firm answer on that, but please, hold that. And whoever asked it, come see me after. I love that question.
Okay, how often should a child be assessed if they've already been assessed? And they said the age is 4 to 6 years old.
So a child needs to be assessed when there's a reason for it. Obviously, the initial assessment reason is the first, and after that, there's a requirement that at least every 3 years eligibility be redetermined. But there's also a requirement that progress be monitored, and if there's something that gives either a parent or a school district the reason to suspect that there's something more or different or new or a change, then an assessment at that point can be requested. A school district is not required to assess more frequently than once a year. But they try to have the reasons for referral be comprehensive enough that whatever evaluation you get for that initial year would be enough for the next year. But that is never set in stone, because things change. Children have brain injuries. There's a bunch of different reasons why another assessment might become necessary.
And parents can always request that too.
I did say parents.
Right.
Parents can always request that.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, the next question has to do with the difficulty that families have accessing due process hearings. And the comment is that the current system really shuts down low-resource families, and what are different options that might be available?
So we're currently working with the Office of Administrative Hearings on this topic as we speak. So I hear you, and we've gotten a lot of feedback from families about that.
But I also heard in that question the idea about options, and one of the other task force recommendations was that every SELPA have the opportunity to get one of what was called an alternative dispute resolution grant. Yep. At the time, both of the SELPAs that I had worked in had that grant, and it seemed like everybody should have that. And so now almost every SELPA does have, I think it's in this next budget cycle.
It went out. Everyone who wanted it could get it,
but there's still a couple that didn't get it for one reason or another. But almost every SELPA in the state in this coming year will now have an alternative dispute resolution grant. And there's kind of a menu of potential alternative dispute resolution ideas. In addition to everything that the Parent Training and Information, Family Resource, and Family Empowerment Centers can offer, which are ways to try to keep solutions as quickly and easily done locally before even having to go to the point of making a request through the Office of Administrative Hearings.
Yeah.
And how would families find out about those options, Maureen, if they wanted to explore alternative dispute resolution?
They
in their
should
area?
contact their SELPA for those earlier options.
And if they have additional questions, they can always call our procedural safeguards unit.
And that was actually another question, Kristin, since you brought it up. What's that number?
Oh.
Oh, the number. You want the number?
1-800.
They want the 800 number, Kristin.
I will get that right now for you.
Every SELPA also is required to have a community advisory committee, and that is a way to both be involved and to find other kinds of supports and services that you can request through them. They all operate differently. It's volunteer. Parents don't have to do this, but every SELPA invites parents to, and so they do vary around the state, but it is a requirement to have a CAC in every SELPA.
Yep.
And you have the 1-800? No, you're...
I'm still looking
And
at
that leads me to my next question, and I think you already gave one resource. Can you identify some places, be it committees, forums, boards, et cetera, where the average parent of a child with special education needs can engage to impact their local educational community and their state educational bodies?
I think we did talk about the Advisory Commission on Special Ed is the state level, and then your board, or if you're part of a multi-district SELPA, either your school board in a single district SELPA, your school board locally, or your whatever your governance is in a multi-district SELPA. All of those different steps have different resources. And because we're such a varied state, there just is no one answer to that. And so depending upon where you live, that answer will vary. But if there's an individual who'd like more, I'd be happy to talk with you more about that afterwards too.
Okay, I have the 1-800 number. Are you ready? 800-926-0648. And that's the procedural safeguard. So basically, if you're wondering about your rights under IDEA for procedural safeguards, they will help you.
And those are usually given out on the, when you go to the IEP, they have the procedural.
It should be
so
on
that
your
phone number
procedural
should be on
safeguards.
that piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And they will, you'll get a message, but they will call you back within 24 hours. We've been working really hard on that, okay? If they don't, let me know.
So this question is, where can people find more information out about universal design for learning? Do you have a recommended resource?
So CAST.
I was going to say CAST, also CAST.org. I think they have the most
Yeah.
comprehensive website on it.
And you can get on their listserv, and they send out all kinds of interesting things that are helpful, just tangible types of things.
And I think if you just Googled Universal Design for Learning, you'd
Yeah.
be amazed at how much information there is there. And this SUMS training group that the MultiTiered System of Supports conversation is about involves an awful lot of that. So it's also a good way to learn about how Universal Design for Learning is being trained
Yeah.
within the state.
And one other point about that is in terms of our state standards, you know, all kids are really responsible to learn their state standards, or their districts are responsible to teach them their state standards. In those state standards, there's what are called the curriculum and frameworks that have been adopted by the state, which is sort of the how. If the standards are the what, the curriculum and frameworks are the how. Embedded in all those hows, there's a ton of reference to universal design for learning. So you're not bringing some new, wild idea. If you're worried about that to your district, you can tell them that this is very much grounded and fundamental in our curriculum and frameworks that have been adopted by the state. So universal design for learning is a core operating principle.
I've been told my special education student encroaches on general education money. Now what? How do I respond?
So there is a requirement that all dollars are for all students first. And so maybe somebody needs to be reminded that every student who is in part of your district does receive funding just as an individual. And that's why students with disabilities are general ed students first. In addition, there are extra funds to support the needs of a student with a disability. Are they adequate in and of themselves? No. And so the very ugly term encroachment is what a local general fund contribution is, which is the understanding that every district does have the responsibility to serve the range of students. So the dollars that you receive on an average for every student isn't enough for every single student as an individual, but across the system, it's supposed to balance out.
It's like the insurance model. You
Yeah.
know, that everyone doesn't need the same level of health care, so everyone pays in, and some people use more and some people use less. It's that idea. And then on top of that, they get the special ed dollars.
Right.
Right.
All right. How are general education teachers being trained to teach kids, for example, students with autism?
How are general ed students?
How are
Teachers.
general education teachers being trained?
So the new teaching performance expectations include many more foundational tenets in positive behavioral supports, in how to organize classrooms, with the thinking about students across very diverse students, including students with autism. And we know that a lot of the needs that students with autism have are the needs that a lot of students with sensory issues and ADHD and a lot of other students benefit from. So a lot of those things are being embedded foundationally in the teaching performance expectations. But, you know, in my opinion, there could always be more.
But that's why the issue for our task force differentiated between what new teachers need to be trained in and the fact that there is a professional development need for those people who got their credentials before that was
Right.
any kind of requirement. So there's really two sides to that question. So one could be to go to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing website and look up the teacher performance expectations, TPEs, and it'll show what the commission has adopted newly credentialed teachers should learn. But the fact of the matter is there's an awful lot of teachers who have a general ed credential who were not trained to do much with disabilities. And so there has been a requirement that is really changed during the budget cuts when we lost all of our professional development days, where we used to be able to at least once a year do a training for general ed teachers on kids' needs with disabilities, and we lost those dollars. Kim Connor, I talk to you about that every year. So it is locally still a requirement that teachers get professional development, and actually, if you go to the language in IDA, I think it was from the 97 version, when the requirement for general ed teachers to be at the IEP meeting was included, that was actually included at the request of NEA and AFT because they wanted teachers to be able to say, wait a minute, if this child's going to be in my classroom, I don't know anything about that. I need help. And so the teacher has the opportunity to say, for this to be successful for this child, here's a need I have. And I don't think most people or teachers are aware of that.
Okay, we have 4 more minutes
All right.
and a lot of questions. So I don't know
okay.
if we're going to get through all of them. What can I do when my child was denied to be fully included in her local high school? I was told she was best educated at a self-contained room because of the gap in education of her regular peers. And no accommodations were offered, it sounds like. Does that sound right?
So the parent always has a right to disagree with the recommendation that the school district provided, and this is the whole issue of free and appropriate public education, is that the definition of appropriate has to be individualized. And so when there's a disagreement between the school district and the parent about what's appropriate for an individual, that's when the parent has a right to say, no, I don't agree with what you're recommending, and so I'm going to appeal this decision. And that can happen in multiple different ways. You could go through an alternative dispute resolution process, you could file for hearing, you could call the procedural safeguards unit, but that's not really a procedure, that's pretty much a disagreement with the IEP. And so the Office of Administrative Hearings becomes an opportunity to say, look, school district, I don't agree with what you're recommending here.
They hear a lot of those cases.
Right,
Yeah.
probably the most.
Yeah.
I think your response to this set of questions, and there are a couple of them that are really similar, would be the same, but I just want to check. If a school refuses to actually conduct an assessment to determine if a child is eligible for special education, sometimes citing that they're getting interventions, sometimes just ignoring the request completely, what should a parent do?
I would remind the school district that there was a letter from the feds not very long ago, called a Dear Colleague letter, that says that you can't use the promise of interventions or RTI or anything like that to delay a request when it's appropriate. The school district does have the opportunity to say, we don't believe that an assessment is necessary for these reasons, but they have to be reasons then that the parent agrees to. And if the parent doesn't agree, they also have that right to go forward with the request for a hearing.
Yep.
One more?
Last question. Has the task force looked at going back to multiple grade in one class, schoolhouse type environment, more inclusion, less stratification?
I couldn't hear all that. Have they looked at?
Did the task force look at going back to the multiple grade model where they're in one classroom but multiple grades, so that there's more inclusion, less stratification?
That would have been something that the Best Practices group did an awful lot of research on various ways to provide more effective instruction. I'm not aware that they got a lot of information on that. It wasn't something that came forward from that subcommittee.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.